Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here at this wonderful conference. The story I would like to tell is, it's, to me, the craziest story of innovation I've ever heard. And it's not crazy because of what ended up being created, although it did end up saving lives. But it's really so impressive to me because of what it teaches us about how creativity happens in the mind, how it happens in the brain, how these 3 pounds of wet gelatinous meat create new ideas. And this is a story that takes place on August 5th, 1949, in the Mann Gulch Wilderness. The Mann Gulch Wilderness is in Montana, and what makes it such an interesting place is it's where the Rocky Mountains dead end into the Great Plains. So you have these tall, jagged peaks that all of a sudden descend to the Missouri River, and then you look out and it's just plains, just flat, tall grass. So on August 5th, it's the hottest day ever recorded in the area. It's 105 degrees, and a plane is flying overhead, and it spots a small wilderness fire. And so they call the National Forest Service in Missoula, Montana, which dispatches in an old World War II bomber 13 smoke jumpers. These are firefighters who drop from the sky, and they drop in small groups, and they equipped with shovels and pickaxes, and they dig fire lines to prevent fires from spreading out of control. So they take off, and they're led by a man named Wag Dodge, which is, you couldn't come up with a more perfect name for the job. He's leading the smoke jumpers. And as soon as they jump out of these planes, stuff starts to go horribly wrong. The first thing that goes wrong is that their radio, which is on a parachute too, the parachute doesn't open, so the radio is smashed on the rocks. So now they're cut off from communication. The second thing that happens is as soon as Wag Dodge gets there, he realizes that this fire, which is reported to be 10 acres, is now 500 acres and is probably burning 10 acres every minute. So it's out of control. Wag Dodge doesn't trust this fire. He's got years of fighting these kinds of fires, and he knows this fire is in a very bad spot. He's worried that it could crown. When a fire crowns, that's when the flames get tall enough to reach into the tops of trees, and they get access to a whole new source of fuel, and then they can really combust. They can get so hot that they start burning rock. So Wag Dodge, they're on top of these mountains, watching the fire burn the plains below, and Wag Dodge's idea, which is the only thing he could think to do, is to head down towards the water. He wants to be near the river. He thinks that's the safe spot. So he sends his men. They start descending this 2,000-foot mountain towards the Missouri River just to be safe. They're watching this whole time the flames on the other side of the river burn the grass. The flames are very high, the fire's moving fast, but he assumes as long as they're near water, they're going to be safe. So now it's 4:30 in the afternoon, twilight hour, and twilights are a dangerous time to be fighting fires because the wind can abruptly shift. So when they're about 500 feet from the water, he watches the wind shift. This wind, which has been blowing the fire away from him, all of a sudden now starts blowing the fire straight at them. He watches as the embers, which are floating in the air, these reeds, river reeds on fire, fly across the river, the wide Missouri River, land on their side of the river, and send the dry tinder grass up in flames. So now his men were 500 feet from this body of water. Now there's a wall of flame between them and the river. So what do the men do? Well, they do what we'd all do. They start running up the hill, running away from the fire as fast as they can. But here's the problem with running away from fire when the fire is chasing up a hill, is that fire, because heat rises, fires accelerate on the uphill. So fires move much faster going uphill than they do downhill. So later Forest Service estimates were that the fire was actually moving 30 miles per hour after the men. So they're running from this fire. They've got a head start. But after a couple minutes, Wag Dodge looks over his shoulder and realizes that the fire is gaining on them. So he tells his men, he yells at them to drop their packs. So they all drop their packs and they keep on running. After another minute, he looks over his shoulder and realizes that there's no way they're going to outrun this fire. That if they keep on running, they're going to die. They're going to be burned alive. The fire is going to chase them down and burn them to death. So he yells at his men to stop. He stands still. His men look back at him like he's crazy. They assume he's just committing suicide, that he's just given up. They all want to reach the top of the ridge, because they assume if they reach the top of the ridge, they can easily outrun the fire going downhill, come back around and get to the Missouri River. That's their thinking. So they're fixated on the ridge. Wag Dodge knows they won't get there, so he stands still. His men ignore him. And then he knows he's got about 30 seconds before this freight train of fire. He says after the fact that it sounds like a freight train before it runs him over. So he was looking at this fire, and that's when he has his big idea. Gets out his matches, lights a match, lights the ground in front of him. The fire burns down and away. He steps into this burned patch of earth, wets his handkerchief with some water from his canteen, covers his face with it, lies down in the burned plot of earth because he realizes that fire can't burn what's already been burned, and waits for the fire to pass over him. 2 minutes later, he emerges completely unscathed from the fire, covered in soot, but he survives. His men, 2 manage to survive because they find a cave just in the nick of time. They're badly burned, but they survive. Everyone else perishes. It remains one of the deadliest encounters for firefighters in the 20th century in America. And you know, it's an amazing story of kind of creativity in the moment, but I think when you learn how the brain comes up with new ideas, it's even more impressive. And there's a technical description for what happened to Wag Dodge. At 4:50 on that afternoon in the Man Gulch Wilderness, he had a moment of insight. He had an aha moment. That's the technical term that psychologists use. And there are 2 defining features to moments of insight. The first is that it's got to feel a little mysterious. You know, here's this problem, it seems insurmountable, and then out of the blue, the answer arrives. You have no idea where it came from. It's just your unconscious throws up some crazy idea, and then there it is. You can't trace it back. You can put people in a lab, and you can play the kids game with them where you just say, are you hot, are you cold, are you getting closer to the answer? And with moments of insight, people go from being freezing cold, they feel no sense of progress, to being burning hot. The answer really comes instantly and out of nowhere. So that's the first defining feature. There's something inherently mysterious about where the answer comes from that suggests all sorts of unconscious processing. The second defining feature is the feeling of certainty that accompanies the revelation. So as soon as this answer pops into your head, you're convinced it's right. You don't have to check it. You don't have to do the math. You just know this is the answer I've been searching for. This is what's going to save my life. Wag Dodge didn't think about the mechanics of creating an escape fire. He just lit the match. And he also didn't have the luxury of time, of course. So these are the 2 defining features of moments of insight. It's for a long time been a very, very mysterious cognitive process. But in the last couple of years, there's been some really interesting research done by researchers, Mark Beeman at Northwestern, John Kunios at Drexel, and some researchers in Austria. And they, of course, were faced with a fundamental scientific problem of you can't put people in a brain scanner inside one of these noisy coffins and wait for them to have an epiphany. That'd be a really inefficient way to do science. So what you have to do is come up with some kind of insight puzzles that can generate lots of data. And so their solution was to come up with something called compound remote associate problems. The acronym is CRAP. And I'll give you an example. Let me make sure I'm giving it to you right. So there are 3 words, and you have to come up with a 4th word that can form a compound word with these 3 words. So I'm going to give you age, mile, and sand. What's the 4th word that can form a compound word with those 3? And you can just raise your hand or shout it out. Yeah, stone. Yeah. So how did that answer come to you? Did it just kind of come out of the blue?
I got it from the second 2 words before the first one, because it came at the end of it.
And then when the answer arrived, did you have to kind of go back and you had to go check? So the other nifty thing about these CRAP problems is that they can be solved both ways. You can really differentiate the brain activity in the fMRI machine. But in general, people typically solve these in moments of insight, in these aha moments. So I can give you another one. Pine, crab, and sauce. Anyone? Pine, crab, and sauce. Apple. Oh, I'm sorry. I just took away someone's moment of glory. So there the answer is apple. So now you give people these word problems, you put them in a brain scanner, and you see a very unique pattern of brain activity. And a bunch of stuff turns on, but to make a long story short, you see specific activity in an obscure part of the right hemisphere called the anterior superior temporal gyrus. It's a blob of brain no one knew too much about. It's been most studied in connection with the invention of metaphors and the processing of jokes. That makes a little bit of sense in retrospect, because what it's a joke, it's kind of a puzzle. Why do a nun, a rabbi, and a priest walk into a bar? And then when you give someone a punchline, that's like a minor aha moment, and then we laugh. So what this brain area seems to be really good at is seeing remote associations, remote connections between things. You've probably never used pine, crab, and sauce in a sentence before, and this brain area is able to scour your unconscious and see the thin thread of apple that connects these three completely unrelated words. A metaphor is the same basic thing. Literally, love has nothing to do with war. But this brain area is able to see that, yes, there are these remote underlying similarities connecting love and war, and thus the metaphor works. So that seems to be what's happening inside your brain. That's what you can learn from an fMRI machine. But they also hooked up people to EEG machines. EEG is like a bulky shower cap, and this detects the electrical waves that are always emanating from your head. And what young Beeman and Kunios found, and this has also been demonstrated by these researchers in Austria, is that you can predict the arrival of an insight 8 seconds before the insight actually appears. So just by looking at this characteristic signal, this pattern of electrical waves on the EEG, you can actually predict whether or not someone's going to have an insight. So you can hook them up to the shower cap, and you can 8 seconds in advance say, you're going to have the answer soon. Or you can say, don't bother. You just come back later. I mean, you can also, sometimes they can give people hints. You can suggest it's going to be a fruit for pine, crab, and sauce. And you can even say, using this characteristic signal, whether or not people are going to be able to make use of these hints. So, it's a very, very interesting predictive signal. And the question, of course, is, well, what is this signal? What defines a signal that's so predictive of our creativity in the moment? And what the signal is alpha wave activity. Like most things in the brain, it remains mostly a mystery. But what alpha waves really correlate with is states of relaxation. So when you're daydreaming, when you're kind of drowsy at 5:30 in the morning lying in bed, when you've gone for a long walk, when you're taking a warm shower, those kinds of states, those kinds of free-flowing, loose, associative states, those are when we're most likely to have moments of insight. And then the question is, well, why would being relaxed make us more likely to be able to generate the word apple, to be able to have these epiphanies? And the reason is that when we're more relaxed, the spotlight of attention turns inwards. That instead of being focused and attentive to the outside world, we're a little bit more attentive to those quiet thoughts. The mind goes quiet, and so it's easier to hear those quiet thoughts emanating from this obscure brain area in the right hemisphere. So we're able to hear that kind of quiet voice saying, the answer is apple. That kind of whisper in the back of our head that gives us the answer. Because these are thoughts we've never thought before. We've never tried to connect pine, crab, and sauce before. No one had ever come up with an escape fire before. These are quiet thoughts. And so the mind has to be a little more quiet, a little bit calmer in order to actually eavesdrop, in order to actually hear these thoughts. Now, they tell a great story. Well, before I get there, there is something, I think, rather counterintuitive about the fact that states of relaxation are most likely to generate moments of insight. You give most people hard problems, and what are they going to do? They're going to drink another cup of espresso. They're going to snort some Ritalin. They're going to chain themselves to their desk, try to invest all their attention in the problem, try to really focus on the terms of the problem, and that, they think, is what's going to give them the answer. Well, that turns out, if you've got an insight problem, if you're relying on a aha moment, that's the exact opposite of what you should be doing. When people are too focused on, for instance, pine, crab, and sauce, what ends up happening is that the wrong answer, the word tree, just keeps on repeating in their head. So they get this broken loop of the wrong answer. That's what happens when you're too focused on the terms of the problem, when you're not relaxed enough. Kunios and Beeman tell a really interesting story about one day they brought a trained expert Tibetan monk into their lab. He was an expert meditator. And they give him these crap problems, and for the first couple minutes, he's just really flailing. He can't solve a single one. Normally, they've got a success rate of about 40% if you give people 30 to 45 seconds. But he's just drawing blanks. He really can't solve them. But then, after a few minutes, all of a sudden, he starts solving one problem after another. He becomes an insight machine. And Kunios describes how they'd never seen anything like that. They'd never had someone go on this streak before where they just solved one problem after another. And what they think was happening was that at first, the monk was just simply too focused on the problems. He was too focused on pine, crab, and sauce. And so his attention was drowning out that quiet voice saying the answer is apple. But then all of a sudden, he got the game. He realized how he had to think. And that's when he was able to actually access these quieter thoughts in his right hemisphere that actually were giving him the answer. And he became, as Kunios describes it, this machine of insight. Now, I think we can go back and look at Wag Dodge and begin to appreciate what was so extraordinary about that moment, why this is such a special story of creativity. I mean, there's nothing, I can't think of a single less relaxing thing, a single scarier thing than being chased by a wall of fire that was 100 feet tall, they estimate at the time. And yet, even in that moment of horrifying fear, of just unbelievable terror, he was able to realize that his fear wasn't going to save him, that he had to somehow forget about this wall of flame that was so hot it was probably singeing his hair. And he had to learn to hear that quiet thought telling him how to do an escape fire. And that, to me, I think, is why it's such an extraordinary story of creativity, how you can use what we've learned in the last couple of years about the brain during aha moments to further appreciate the invention of the escape fire. The escape fire, of course, now is a standard firefighting technique that saves countless lives. It's one of the first things that's taught to every firefighter who has to fight these fires in the wilderness. So thank you so much for your attention. Again, it really is a pleasure being here. Thank you.